U.S. Rangers mocked an old veteran's tattoo, until the general recognized the symbol of a fallen squad. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories are carried by the quietest people, hidden beneath faded ink and weathered skin. This is the account of how a single tattoo on an old man's arm unleashed a military secret that had been buried for over 50 years, and how one afternoon at a family gathering revealed that some heroes are forgotten by design, not by accident. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds of Fort Benning as families gathered for the monthly celebration that brought together active duty personnel with their loved ones. Children ran across the manicured grass while parents chatted in small groups, creating the kind of wholesome American scene that recruitment posters tried to capture but never quite managed to replicate authentically. Randall Bishop sat alone on a weathered wooden bench at the edge of the festivities, his 82-year-old frame draped in clothes that had seen better decades. His flannel shirt was clean but faded, his jeans worn thin at the knees, and his sneakers bore the scuffs of someone who walked everywhere because driving had become too challenging for eyes that had seen too much and hands that trembled with memories more than age. To the casual observer, Randall appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an elderly man enjoying the warmth of a Georgia afternoon while watching children play. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades working outdoors, and his gray hair was neatly combed despite the fact that no one was likely to notice or comment on his appearance. There was something peaceful about his solitude, as if he had found contentment in simply observing life rather than actively participating in it. But it was the tattoo on his left forearm that would soon shatter the tranquil atmosphere of the family gathering and trigger events that would reach the highest levels of military command. The ink had faded to a dull blue-green over the decades, and the design had blurred enough that its details were difficult to discern from any distance. What had once been sharp lines and precise imagery now appeared as an indistinct mass of color that might have represented anything from a military insignia to a drunken mistake made in some long-forgotten port town. Sergeant Jake Miller first noticed the old man while leading a group of his fellow Rangers toward the refreshment tent. At 26, Miller embodied everything the modern military valued: physical fitness, tactical proficiency, and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from knowing he belonged to one of the most elite units in the American Armed Forces. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing spoke of countless hours of training, and his chest bore ribbons that marked him as someone who had seen actual combat in the ongoing conflicts that defined his generation's military experience. "Look at this old-timer," Miller said to his companions, nodding toward Randall with the casual dismissiveness that young people often showed toward the elderly, "trying to look military with that sad excuse for a tattoo." The other Rangers followed Miller's gaze and saw what he saw: an old man whose appearance suggested someone trying to claim connection to military service he had never earned. In their world of precise standards and earned honors, the sight of what appeared to be a faded, poorly executed tattoo on someone who clearly wasn't maintaining military fitness standards triggered a response that mixed professional pride with personal arrogance. "Probably got that ink done at some dive bar when he was 18 and drunk," commented Corporal Davis, a newer Ranger who was still proving himself to the more experienced members of his unit. "Thinks it makes him look like a veteran." Miller's expression hardened as he studied Randall more carefully. In the military culture he inhabited, stolen valor was considered one of the most serious offenses that a civilian could commit. The idea that someone would falsely claim military service or decorations they hadn't earned was viewed as a direct insult to everyone who had genuinely served, and Miller had developed a particular sensitivity to what he perceived as such deceptions. "You know what? I think we should go have a conversation with Grandpa over there," Miller announced, his voice taking on the edge that his fellow Rangers recognized as a prelude to confrontation. "Find out exactly what he thinks that tattoo represents, and whether he has any right to be displaying it on a military installation." The group of Rangers began walking toward Randall's bench with the purposeful stride of predators who had identified prey. Their movement was casual enough not to alarm the families around them, but focused enough that anyone familiar with military behavior would have recognized the signs of an approaching confrontation. Randall noticed their approach with the peripheral awareness that came from decades of training that had never fully left him despite his advanced age. He continued watching the children play, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly as old instincts awakened and assessed the potential threat moving toward him. "Afternoon, sir," Miller said as the group reached Randall's bench, his tone carrying the false courtesy that preceded most interrogations. "Beautiful day for a family gathering, isn't it?" Randall looked up at the young soldiers with eyes that held depths these rangers couldn't begin to fathom. "Yes, it is," he replied simply, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who felt no need to justify his presence or explain himself to strangers. Miller positioned himself directly in front of Randall, using his height and physical conditioning to create an intimidating presence. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo there. Mind if I ask what it represents?" The question was phrased as a request, but delivered with the expectation of compliance that military personnel used when dealing with civilians they considered subordinate. Miller's companions spread out slightly, creating a semicircle that would prevent easy escape if the old man decided to leave rather than answer their questions. Randall glanced down at his faded tattoo, then back up at Miller with an expression that remained neutral despite the obvious aggression in the young soldier's posture. "It's something from a long time ago," he said quietly. "Nothing that would interest you." The non-answer seemed to confirm Miller's suspicions about stolen valor, and his voice grew sharper as he pressed the interrogation. "Actually, sir, it interests me quite a bit. You see, my friends and I here are rangers. We have earned our place in this military through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and we don't appreciate people who try to claim honors they haven't earned." Several nearby families had begun to notice the confrontation developing around the old man on the bench. Parents pulled their children closer whilst trying to appear as if they weren't watching, sensing tension, but uncertain whether they should intervene or simply avoid getting involved in what appeared to be military business. Randall's hands remained steady as he folded them in his lap, his expression unchanged despite the increasing hostility of the young soldiers surrounding him. "I haven't claimed any honors," he replied with the same quiet dignity. "I'm just sitting here watching the children play." Miller's frustration grew as the old man refused to be intimidated or provoked into the kind of defensive reaction that would justify escalating the confrontation. "Right. Just sitting here with your fake military tattoo hoping people will think you're some kind of war hero. Well, I've got news for you, Grandpa. We can spot a poser from a mile away." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, and Randall felt something stir deep in his chest. Not anger at the young soldier's ignorance, but sadness at how little they understood about the true nature of service and sacrifice. The tattoo they were mocking represented memories that would never leave them, friends who had died in places that didn't officially exist, and missions that had been erased from history to protect national security interests that these rangers couldn't begin to comprehend. As the confrontation continued to escalate and more onlookers began to gather, none of them could have predicted that within the hour, this quiet family gathering would be transformed into the site of one of the most significant military recognitions in modern history, triggered by a phone call that would reach the highest levels of command and reveal secrets that had been buried for over half a century. Sarah Martinez had been watching the confrontation unfold from her position near the playground equipment, her maternal instincts immediately triggered by the sight of young soldiers surrounding an elderly man who appeared to pose no threat to anyone. As a military spouse herself, she understood the warrior culture that sometimes led to aggressive behavior, but she also recognized bullying when she saw it, regardless of whether it was happening in a schoolyard or on a military installation. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma had been playing on the nearby swing set when the raised voices began drawing attention from other families in the area. Sarah could see that the situation was escalating beyond mere conversation, and her concern deepened as she noticed more rangers joining the group around the old man's bench. "Mommy, why are those soldiers being mean to that man?" Emma asked, her child's instinct for fairness making her uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah replied, pulling out her cell phone as she made a decision to get involved. "But I think someone needs to help him." Sarah had grown up in a military family and married into another one, giving her decades of experience in navigating the complex social dynamics of military communities. Her father, retired Sergeant Major Robert Wallace, had served for 30 years before transitioning to a civilian career that still kept him connected to military networks and historical research. If anyone could provide insight into what was happening with the elderly veteran and his tattoo, it would be him. The phone rang twice before her father's familiar voice answered with the professional courtesy he had maintained even in retirement. "Wallace here." "Dad, it's Sarah. I'm at Fort Benning for Family Day, and there's a situation developing that I think you need to know about. Some young rangers are harassing an elderly man about his military tattoo, accusing him of stolen valor." "Sarah, you know I can't get involved in active duty discipline issues," Wallace began, but his daughter interrupted before he could finish the standard response. "Dad, this isn't about discipline. This is about an old man who's sitting alone on a bench while a group of soldiers humiliate him in public. The tattoo they're questioning looks military, but it's faded and hard to make out clearly. Wallace's tone shifted slightly as his protective instincts engaged. What does the tattoo look like? Can you describe it? Sarah moved closer to get a better view, careful not to draw attention to herself as she studied the ink on Randall's exposed forearm. It's on his left arm, very faded. Looks like it might be a snake in some kind of circle or ring, with what could be a star in the center. The whole thing is pretty blurred with age. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. When her father finally spoke, his voice carried an urgency that she had rarely heard from him, even during his most demanding military assignments. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. I need you to describe that tattoo again, in as much detail as you can see, and I need to know the man's name if possible. Dad, what's wrong? You sound like... The tattoo, Sarah. Describe it again. Sarah looked more closely, trying to make out details through the fading ink and the distance between her position and the bench. It definitely looks like a snake, maybe biting its own tail to form a circle. There's a 5-pointed star in the center, and there might be some smaller details that I can't make out from here. She could hear her father typing rapidly on a computer keyboard, his breathing audible over the phone as he searched for something in what sounded like military databases or historical records. Is there any way you can find out his name without getting involved in the confrontation? Wallace asked, his voice now carrying the kind of command authority that Sarah remembered from her childhood. I can try. Dad, you're scaring me. What is this about? I can't explain over an unsecured line, but if this is what I think it is, those young soldiers are making a mistake that could have serious consequences for their careers. I need you to keep everyone there until I can make some phone calls. Before Sarah could ask more questions, she heard her father hang up, leaving her standing with her phone in her hand, and a growing sense that she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple misunderstanding between generations of military personnel. 300 miles away, Robert Wallace was already dialing a number that connected him directly to the office of the commanding general at Fort Benning. As a retired sergeant major with decades of service and ongoing contracts with military historical research projects, he still maintained access to networks that most civilians never knew existed. This is Sergeant Major Wallace, retired. I need to speak with General Matthews immediately regarding a potential security issue involving classified historical operations. The urgency in his voice bypassed normal screening procedures, and within minutes he was connected to a 4-star general whose afternoon briefing schedule was about to be completely disrupted by information that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of military command. General, I have reason to believe that a member of Task Force Night Adder is currently at Fort Benning being harassed by active duty personnel who don't understand the significance of his service record. The words Night Adder had the same effect on General Matthews that they had on Wallace. Instant recognition of something that officially didn't exist but had been legendary within certain circles of military leadership for over 5 decades. Are you certain about this identification? Matthews asked, his voice taking on the careful tone that senior officers use when discussing matters that could have national security implications. The description matches archive photographs, and the individual's approximate age is consistent with surviving members of that unit. General, if this is who I think it is, we're dealing with a ghost from one of the most classified operations of the Vietnam era. General Matthews was already reaching for his secure communication system as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. Task Force Night Adder had been officially disbanded, and its records sealed so deeply that most current military personnel had never heard of its existence. The fact that a surviving member might be alive and on a military installation being treated disrespectfully by active duty soldiers represented both a security concern and a moral obligation that demanded immediate response. I'm deploying a security team to your location immediately, Matthews told Wallace. Can your daughter maintain visual contact with the individual until we arrive? I believe so, General, but you should know that the situation's escalating. The longer those Rangers continue their harassment, the more attention this is going to draw from other personnel and families. As phone calls began cascading through military communication networks and emergency response protocols activated across multiple installations, none of the participants in the confrontation at Fort Benning could have imagined that they were about to become part of a story that would force the military establishment to confront secrets it had kept buried for over half a century. General Thomas Matthews set down his secure phone with hands that trembled slightly as the implications of the conversation began to sink in. In 35 years of military service, he had dealt with crises ranging from terrorist attacks to international incidents, but the possibility that a surviving member of Task Force Night Adder was being harassed on his installation represented something unprecedented in his experience. Night Adder had been more than just another classified unit. It had been a ghost operation that officially never existed, composed of soldiers who had been declared killed in action to protect the secrecy of missions that violated international law and diplomatic agreements. The 12-man team had been tasked with deep reconnaissance and rescue operations behind enemy lines, working in areas where American military presence could never be acknowledged. According to the sealed records that only a handful of senior officers were cleared to read, Night Adder had been wiped out during a mission in 1968 when they attempted to rescue a downed pilot from North Vietnamese territory. The official story was that all team members had died in the attempt, their bodies never recovered, their families told that they had been killed in routine combat operations whose details were classified for national security reasons. Matthews reached for his emergency communication system and began issuing orders that would mobilize resources across multiple commands. I need a full security detail and my command helicopter prepared for immediate departure to the Family Day area. Code Black priority. His aide, Colonel Patricia Evans, had worked with the general long enough to recognize when situations demanded absolute compliance without questions. Sir, should I notify base security about the nature of the emergency? Negative. This is compartmentalized until I can assess the situation personally. But I want a full honor guard prepared and our best ceremonial detail standing by. If this is what I think it is, we're going to need to correct a 50-year-old injustice in front of a crowd of witnesses. As military personnel scrambled to fulfill orders they didn't fully understand, Matthews pulled the classified files that detailed what little was known about Night Adder's final mission. The photographs in the dossier showed 12 young soldiers whose faces bore the kind of quiet intensity that marked men who had volunteered for assignments with low survival rates. Among those faces was a 20-year-old soldier named Randall Bishop, whose service record indicated exceptional performance in reconnaissance and survival training. According to the mission reports, Bishop had been presumed dead, along with his teammates when their helicopter extraction failed and communications were lost during the rescue attempt. The idea that Bishop might have survived might have been living as a civilian for over 5 decades, while officially listed as killed in action, represented both a military miracle and a bureaucratic nightmare that would require careful handling to avoid embarrassing questions about government accountability and veteran services. Meanwhile, back at Fort Benning, Sarah Martinez continued to monitor the escalating confrontation, while trying to appear as if she was simply supervising her daughter's playground activities. The group of rangers around Randall's bench had grown from 4 to nearly 8 soldiers, and their questioning had become increasingly aggressive, as the old man's calm responses frustrated their attempts to provoke him into admitting fraud. "You know what I think?" Sergeant Miller was saying, his voice loud enough to draw attention from families throughout the immediate area. "I think you're one of those sad old men who buys military gear at surplus stores and pretends to be a veteran for attention and free meals." Randall's expression remained unchanged, but Sarah noticed that his hands had begun to tremble slightly, not with fear, but with what appeared to be suppressed emotion. The old man's eyes held a distant quality, as if he was seeing something far beyond the immediate confrontation. "I never asked for attention," Randall replied quietly. "I never asked for anything from anyone." "Right," Miller continued, his sarcasm becoming more pronounced as he sensed what he perceived as weakness. "Just sitting here with your fake tattoo, hoping someone will thank you for your service that never happened." It was at that moment that Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the other rangers had pulled out his cell phone and appeared to be recording the confrontation, probably planning to post the stolen Valor encounter on social media for entertainment and military community approval. She immediately called her father back, her voice urgent with new concern. "Dad, they were recording this. If this man is who you think he is, this is about to become a public humiliation that could go viral. Sarah, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it right now," Wallace replied, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that brooked no argument. "I need you to approach that group and tell them that military police are en route, and that they need to cease their harassment immediately." "Dad, I can't just—" "This is not a request. That man may be a Medal of Honor recipient whose service was classified for national security reasons. If these soldiers continue this harassment and post it online, it could trigger a national scandal that damages military reputation and violates security protocols that are still in effect." Sarah felt her heart racing as she understood that she was being asked to intervene in a military situation that was far more complex than anyone at the family gathering could have imagined. But her father's tone left no room for argument, and her own sense of justice demanded that she take action to protect an elderly man who was being treated with cruelty he didn't deserve. As she began walking toward the confrontation, Sarah could hear the sound of helicopters approaching from the distance, multiple aircraft moving with the kind of urgency that suggested official response rather than routine training flights. The family day gathering was about to be transformed into something none of the participants could have anticipated. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and several families began looking toward the sky as military helicopters appeared on the horizon, approaching the installation with obvious purpose and priority. What had begun as a simple family gathering was about to become the site of one of the most significant military recognitions in modern history. The thunder of helicopter rotors grew deafening as 3 Blackhawks descended on the family day area, their urgent arrival causing parents to gather children and spectators to back away from the impromptu landing zone. General Matthews emerged before the rotors stopped spinning, his 4-star uniform commanding immediate attention from every military person present. Sergeant Miller and his Rangers found themselves frozen as they realized their harassment of an elderly civilian had triggered response from the highest command levels. The cell phone recording their confrontation was quickly pocketed as the young soldiers began understanding they had made a catastrophic error. General Matthews strode directly toward Randall's bench, his expression grim with purpose. When he reached the elderly man and the general came to attention and rendered the most perfect military salute anyone present had witnessed, transforming the mundane gathering into something approaching sacred ceremony, Randall rose slowly and returned the salute with movements carrying decades of military training, his weathered hands maintaining perfect form despite age's tremor. "Sergeant Bishop," Matthews said formally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "It is an honor to finally meet you, sir." The use of military rank sent confusion through the Rangers who had assumed they were dealing with a civilian imposter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Matthews announced to the assembled crowd, "you are in the presence of Sergeant Randall Bishop, the last surviving member of Task Force Night Adder, one of the most classified and heroic units in American military history." Matthews continued his explanation, providing context that would transform everyone's understanding. Task Force Night Adder conducted deep reconnaissance and rescue missions behind enemy lines during Vietnam. Their operations were so sensitive that all team members were officially listed as killed in action to protect national security. The revelation that Randall had been officially dead for 50 years while living as a civilian created profound silence. "The tattoo, some question," Matthews continued with harder edge, "is the sacred symbol of a Night Adder brotherhood, representing sacrifice and courage most soldiers will never demonstrate." General Matthews withdrew classified documents. "Sergeant Bishop, by order of the Secretary of Defense, you are hereby awarded the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and Purple Heart, with 3 oak leaf clusters, decorations earned 50 years ago, but unreceivable due to classified service." The crowd erupted in applause, understanding they witnessed not just recognition, but correction of historical injustice. Matthews gestured for the harassing Rangers to step forward. "Gentlemen," he said with stern authority, "you've learned the most important lesson of your careers. True heroes rarely announce themselves, and genuine service often goes unrecognized by those who benefit most." The transformations of Randall Bishop from unknown elderly man to recognized war hero became national news within hours. Social media platforms that had prepared to showcase stolen valor instead shared videos of a 4-star general saluting a Medal of Honor recipient whose service had been classified for decades. 3 weeks later, Sergeant Miller sat across from Randall in a small coffee shop, a thick research folder between them. The young ranger who had accused Randall of stolen valor now carried himself with humility born from profound lessons about assumptions and respect. "Sergeant Bishop," Miller began without his former arrogance, "I've spent 3 weeks studying Night Adder and your service record. I understand now that my actions were inexcusable, and I apologize not just for my behavior but for my ignorance about sacrifices soldiers like you made." Randall studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with hunger for understanding that suggested capacity for growth. "Jake," Randall said using his first name, "the most important lesson is that military service takes many forms, and heroism often wears ordinary clothes. You made assumptions based on appearances rather than understanding the person." Miller opened his folder, revealing dozens of pages about Night Adder operations and casualty reports. "What I don't understand is how you carried this alone for so many years. The missions, losing teammates, not being able to tell the people about your service. How do you live with that isolation?" "The hardest part wasn't secrecy," Randall replied. "It was losing my brothers and not being able to honor their memory publicly. When people talked about Vietnam veterans, my teammates weren't included, because officially they died in routine operations, rather than extraordinary missions they volunteered for." "Can you tell me about them? Not the missions, but the people. What were they like?" The question unlocked something carefully contained for decades. Tommy Rodriguez was our medic who could make anyone laugh in the worst situations. Marcus Williams could fix any radio with spare parts and determination. David Chen had supernatural instincts about enemy movement. James Patterson, we called him Preach, kept us grounded when stress threatened to break us. Miller took notes, understanding he was receiving education about military service unavailable in any manual. These stories revealed warfare's human dimension, often lost in discussions of strategy and tactics. "I think about them every day," Randall concluded. "Not how they died, but how they lived. They were ordinary young men who did extraordinary things because they believed in something larger than themselves. That's real military service. Not uniforms or medals, but willingness to sacrifice for others." As Miller packed his materials, he understood his encounter with Randall had fundamentally changed his understanding of military service and heroism. 6 months later, he would lead a new Fort Benning program, educating soldiers about military history and veteran respect, named in honor of Task Force Night Adder. The most lasting impact was personal. Miller learned that true strength appeared as quiet dignity, genuine heroes rarely sought recognition, and the most important military virtue was not combat courage, but compassion for those who served before.